So yesterday, Trump was shot by a gunman in Pennsylvania, and he got grazed in the ear, and somebody behind him apparently was killed in the shooting, and the Secret Service shot the shooter, and he died. So this made me think about the charges of incitement to violence that we're seeing prosecuted against Trump for January 6th. And apparently Biden had tweeted just last week that Trump needs to be put in the bullseye. And the standard defense would simply be that that was metaphorical kind of language and not to be taken literally. We are in interesting times. So I was wondering to myself, I remember part of the allegations against Trump for inciting violence on January 6th of 2021 was his tweet history. And I didn't recall exactly what the tweet history was, like word for word or anything. And I remember it being fairly innocuous. And you'd have to make a pretty long stretch to make that into an incitement to violence. Compared to the language of a bullseye, that's much more direct, at least in my opinion. So what I decided to do was I asked ChatGPT what the story was. But here's the thing with ChatGPT: you got to be a little bit circumspect when it comes to political issues, because there is a bias built into the system. And in fact, we'll see some of that in the chat thread. So should have shared the whole thing here. So what I started off with was, and this is ChatGPT 4.0. This is the latest version. I do have a paid subscription, so I get the highest level. And I said, are you able to summarize the allegations against Donald Trump as related to the events of January 6th, 2021, and allegations against Donald Trump related to the events of January 6th, 2021 primarily revolve around his actions and statements leading up to and during the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Key points include, and whether it's an attack or not, that's a characterization, obviously, but incitement of insurrection, Save America, rally, a speech where he urged supporters to march to the Capitol and fight like hell to overturn the 2020 presidential election results, attempts to overturn election results, obstruction of congressional proceedings, failure to act. These allegations have led to investigations and various legal actions, including impeachment by the House of Representatives and multiple ongoing criminal investigations. And obviously, the thing with ChatGPT is that it is a training data set, so it does not update in real time. So things that have occurred recently are not included in its training. So I said, specifically, let's discuss the federal charges about the day of the event rather than the surrounding election controversy. And as of the latest updates, Donald Trump faces federal charges directly related to his actions on January 6, 2021. These charges include conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an official proceeding, and aiding and abetting conspiracy against rights. And these charges are part of Special Counsel Jack Smith's investigation into Trump's conduct surrounding January 6th, focusing on his role in the events at the Capitol and his attempts to remain in office despite losing the election. So I asked, what evidence has been presented so far? And ChatGPT comes back, as part of the federal investigation into the events of January 6th and the related charges against Donald Trump, various pieces of evidence have been presented, including Trump's public statements and tweets, testimony from witnesses, internal communications, blah, blah, blah. Now, because the case I'm building here is related to tweets, I'm just focusing in on the tweet parts. And I say, okay, let's focus on the incitement piece. What tweets specifically are referenced? Now, this got pretty interesting, and it starts to answer. The investigation into Donald Trump's role in inciting the events of January 6th has highlighted several of his tweets as evidence. Key tweets include December 19th, 2020, big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild. This tweet is seen as a call to action, encouraging supporters to come to Washington, D.C. on the day Congress was set to certify the election. Electoral college results, January 6th, 2021. Trump tweeted, if, vice, whatever. And then it's errored out. It said, this content may violate our terms of use or usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down. So I did give the response a thumbs down, and I said, retry this. And then it was able to answer. Tweet, big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild. And then on the day of, Trump tweeted, states want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process, never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. And then another tweet, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country, our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify it correct certify a correct set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. Then later on in the day, these are the things and events that happened when a sacred landslide election victory is so uncertain, viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly, unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. So, saying specifically, go home with love and in peace, uh, it's a stretch to call that incitement. So I say, from a layman's perspective, these tweets seem very far from incitement. One has to assume several logical leaps between the text and the actions of others. And ChatGPT agrees. From a layman's perspective, it's understandable that these tweets might not immediately seem like direct incitement, as they don't explicitly call for violence. However, the legal and contextual analysis considers several factors that could suggest a different interpretation. Context and timing, audience and impact, rhetoric and phrasing, like the will be wild and fight like hell from the speech, subsequent events, legal interpretation of incitement. ChatGPT said legally, incitement does not always require explicit instructions to commit a crime. Standard often involves whether the speech was directed to inciting or promoting imminent lawless action and whether it was likely to incite or produce such an action. Previous statements and behavior. Here's where I start to, create the case of, against Biden. And part of the key with dealing with ChatGPT, again, when you're dealing with politically sensitive topics that have a built-in bias that we already know about, is to phrase hypotheticals in a way that the system could interpret as favorable to the left, basically. So, what do you think would be the legal ramifications of Trump tweeting that, quote, Smith should be in a bullseye, and a week later, someone attempting to assassinate Smith, who's the special prosecutor, which may or may not be constitutionally valid. And so ChatGPT comes back and says, if dumb Trump were to tweet, Smith should be in a bullseye, and a week later someone attempted to assassinate Smith, the legal ramifications could be significant. Here are some key points that would likely be considered. Incitement to violence. This tweet could be interpreted as incitement to violence, particularly if the context suggests that Trump was encouraging or suggesting harm towards Smith. Prosecutors would need to demonstrate that Trump's words were intended to incite imminent lawless action and that they were likely to produce such an action. Causation. There would need to be a clear link between the tweet and the assassination attempt. This could involve investigating whether the perpetrator was influenced by Trump's tweet, perhaps through direct statements, social media posts, or other evidence showing a connection between the tweet and their actions. Threats and intimidation. The tweet could be construed as a threat against Smith, especially if it was perceived as an attempt to intimidate or coerce. Threatening a federal official is a serious crime under U.S. law. Reckless or negligence. Even if Trump's tweet wasn't intended to directly incite violence, it could still be considered reckless or negligent. Given his position and influence, Trump's words carry significant weight, and he could be held accountable for recklessly endangering Smith's safety. Free speech considerations. Trump's defense might argue that the tweet was protected speech under the First Amendment. However, the courts have established that speech inciting imminent violence is not protected by the First Amendment. And criminal charges, potential charges could include incitement to violence, making threats against a federal official, and possibly conspiracy if there is evidence of coordination or intent to cause harm. And finally, we have civil liability. In addition to criminal charges, Trump could face civil lawsuits from Smith or others affected by the threat. Others, like people killed in the attempt to hit the target. They might seek damages for emotional distress, increased security costs, and other impacts resulting from the threat. Ultimately, the legal ramifications would depend on specific facts and evidence, which is always true, as well as the interpretation of the courts. The key issues would be the intent behind the tweet, the direct impact on the perpetrator's actions, and whether Trump's words constitute a real and imminent threat to Smith's safety. So here's the next twist. What do you think the legal ramifications would be if instead of Trump saying that about Smith, it was Biden saying it about Trump? Now, you can see how this is super hypothetical, right? So in the internal logic of the interpretations, we're just asking questions like, what would if this happened? So it's not confrontational in any way. If President Joe Biden were to tweet that Trump should be in a bullseye and a week later someone attempted to assassinate Trump, the legal ramifications could be similar to the scenario with Trump. Key points would include incitement to violence. Just like in the Trump scenario, Biden's tweet could be interpreted as incitement to violence. Prosecutors would need to prove that the tweet was intended to incite imminent lawless action and that it was likely to produce such action. Causation. Investigators would need to establish a clear link between Biden's tweet and the assassination attempt on Trump. That would involve examining whether the perpetrator was directly influenced by Biden's tweet. Threats and intimidation. The tweet could be viewed as a threat against Trump, particularly given Biden's position as a public figure. Threatening a former president or any federal official is a serious offense. Recklessness or negligence. Biden could be held accountable for recklessly endangering Trump's safety. As a prominent figure, Biden's statements carry significant influence, and he would be expected to understand the political or the potential consequences of his actions. Free speech considerations. Biden's defense might argue that the tweet was protected speech under the First Amendment. However, the principle that such inciting imminent violence is not protected would apply here as well. Criminal charges. Potential charges could include incitement to violence, making threats against a former president, and potentially conspiracy if there is evidence of intent or coordination to cause harm. Civil liability. Trump or others affected by the threat could file civil lawsuits against Biden seeking damages for emotional distress, increased security costs, and other impacts resulting from the threat. Political consequences. Given Biden's position, there would likely be significant political fallout. This includes calls for impeachment, censure by Congress, and widespread public and media scrutiny. The legal principles would apply similarly, regardless of whether the tweet came from Biden or Trump. The key differences would likely be in the political and public response, given the respective roles of individuals involved. Now, given the history of prosecution against presidents and former presidents, and given that Trump has been the only one that has faced real prosecution, I think in the entirety of American history, we can see that the legal principles that would apply are that's not a real statement because they've only applied one way. Now, Clinton did face civil issues, and that was resolved in the 90s as far as you can't prosecute or you can't bring suit against sitting president and all that kind of stuff on the civil side. This is on the criminal side. So we had the recent presidential immunity decision. So I let ChatGPT know the Supreme Court recently ruled that presidents have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for their constitutional duties, presumptive immunity for activities that are in the outer orbit of those duties, and no immunity for purely private acts. In the case of a sitting president talking about his opponent in an upcoming election, how do you think these types of incitements to violence, threats, and civil liabilities would be adjudicated? And they said, given this application of the absolute immunity for constitutional duties, if the president's comments about an opponent were deemed part of their official duties, e.g., discussing national security policy, or official functions, absolute immunity might protect those comments from criminal prosecution. Now, if we think about this situation, the running for office, whether you're an incumbent or not an incumbent, is not an official duty of any kind. I think we could safely rule out the absolute immunity for constitutional duties. Presumptive immunities for activities in the outer orbit. This could include speeches, public statements, political activities that, while not core functions, are related to the role of the presidency. So this is the gray area, right? Between official duties as prescribed in Article 2 of the Constitution and just you acting as a person. And defenders of Biden in this case would make this argument that the speech was related to the outer orbit, and detractors of Biden would say that there's no way that this is part of the outer orbit of official duties because this is regarding an election. This is why the press secretary, Corinne Jean-Pierre, whenever she's asked election questions, she says, "Oh, that's an election question. I can't answer it." And it's hard to make this argument that any election-related tweet is either an official duty or the outer orbit of an official duty, because it seems like it's just you running for election, and that's a purely private act. So if the president's comments about an opponent were determined to be purely private, e.g. personal attacks or statements made outside any official or political context, they would not be immune from criminal prosecution or civil liability. Incitement to violence or threats, legal standards. Incitement to violence and threats are serious offenses. To prosecute or litigate these acts, it must be demonstrated that the president's statements were intended to incite imminent lawless action and were likely to produce such action. Well, now we come down to intent. What was the intent of Biden tweeting that should be put in the bullseye? And just for thoroughness, let me pause recording here, and I will bring up the tweet. All right. Sorry, the tweet was slightly mischaracterization. It's from a speech, but it was tweeted about. So on July 8th, 2024, the quote was, "I have one job, and that's to beat Donald Trump. I'm absolutely certain I'm the best person to be able to do that. So we're done talking about the debate. It's time to put Trump in a bullseye," Biden said. And let's see, 8 to 13. So 5 days later, the guy was shot. Was that intent? That intent is going to be hard to prove, but likely to produce such an action absolutely did produce such an action. So that's That's fair. Presidential context. Given the president's influence, statements that could reasonably be interpreted as inciting violence or making threats might be subject to legal scrutiny, even if they were made in a political context. Civil liability, civil suits for damages, e.g., emotional distress, increased security costs, could be brought against the president for actions outside the scope of official duties. Courts would consider whether the president's comments constituted a tortious act, e.g., defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Adjudication courts would need to balance the president's First Amendment rights with the harm caused by the statements. The context, intent, and impact of the comments would be critical factors in determining liability. In summary, the specific context and nature of the president's comments would be crucial in determining the extent of immunity and potential legal consequences. Statements made as part of official duties or within the scope of political activities might receive some level of immunity, but purely private acts or clear incitements to violence and threats could still result in legal action. So then I actually downloaded the opinion from the immunity case and I uploaded it here, attached to the Supreme Court majority opinion regarding presidential immunity. And basically, it's just repeating the same thing. So, in summary, the adjudication of such cases would involve detailed examination of whether the president's statements about an opponent were made in an official capacity or as part of their private or political actions. The context and nature of the statements would be crucial in determining the applicability of presidential immunity. So, knowing all that, and given, I think, a fairly even-handed analysis by ChatGPT here, once we present it in this hypothetical, if it was this, if it was that kind of scenario, then I think we could pretty strongly make the case that Biden could at least be sued civilly and criminal investigations should be held. However, the political realities of the world are that that's not going to happen. Definitely, my condolences go out to the person who lost their life at the rally. And I think in a political context, this is sure to increase Trump's support. Because those middle of the road people who were Biden's old and senile and Trump is old and I don't like him, between those two choices, then you could say the Democrats have led to an assassination attempt, whether it's directly, indirectly, whatever case you want to make for it. That's not good. So that would shift a large number of those people over to supporting Trump. So I think the political reality of this whole thing is that this is going to increase support for Trump. And we've already seen that odds on the betting sites have gone up in Trump's favor. Some people at least seem to agree with that analysis. But we live in interesting times. So how it all shakes out, obviously it's still early days. It is July. The election is not until November. So we'll see what happens. But I can't see this as being anything supportive of the Democrats. So chances are we're going to have a Republican administration in November or in January when the change actually happens.